Shalom, family. Hope all is well. Shabbat shalom. Hope everybody doing all right today. Hope everybody is doing all right. Give me 1 second. We're going to get started. We're doing part 5, identifying the biblical Israelites, going into where we left off, going into more sources. You know what I mean? And, we're just going to get into it. I'm just trying to check on my phone, make sure everything is everything. Give me 1 second. Yep, I think we should be good. I'm just want to make sure sound is good. Yep. All right, cool. Give me 1 second, y'all. All right, y'all, what's going on? Shabbat shalom. Hope everybody's doing good. Let me just fix my head wrap. Trying to make sure everything look good. But anyways, hope y'all are doing well. I'm blessed this Shabbat. Excuse me, I'm sorry, no complaints. So today, part 5, identifying the biblical Israelites. Let me pull up my slides, and then we just gonna get straight into it. Last we finished off talking about the Spanish Inquisition with the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, and that's where we're gonna continue at today. So this is where we finished off last time, and I want to say this was John Ogilvy. Yeah, I want to say this was John Ogilvy. America description, accurate description of the New World. It's talking about King John, the King of Portugal, King John III, and basically how they took the children of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews and deported them to the island of Sao Tome. So we're just going to continue in that, talking about the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, and we're going to continue out on the history, and we're going to make a lot of connections, right? We're going to tie it all in this part of, the teaching. So I'm going to go to the next slide. This is a book written by Wilson Armistead, written in the 1800s, and it's called A Tribute to the Negro. All right, so let's see what he has to say. So this is basically the screenshot from the book, but I'm going to read it from what I've typed out. So basically it says, instances of white people who have become black in consequence of migrating into tropical latitudes are more rare and not so distinctly made out. Yet, according to several accurately informed and scientific writers such as Waddington, Dr. Ruppel, and M. Rosette, there are black races in Africa among the genuine descendants of immigrants from Arabia. Detachments of the Arabian family immigrated 11 or 1200 years ago into northern Africa, where they founded states of some importance. And in some instances, they have passed into a perfectly black complexion, although improved in form and stature, and notwithstanding that they reside to the north of the Negro countries. A remarkable fact in the history of Luango and the Empire of Congo is that the country, according to a statement which was fully credited by Odenthorpe himself, a writer of most correct judgment and impeachable veracity, contains many Jews settled into it. All right, next page. Who retain their religious rights and the distinct habits which keep them isolated from other nations. Though thus separate from the African population, they are black and resemble the other Negroes in every respect as to physical character. It is probably in allusion to this case that Pennington in his book in his textbook says the descendants of a colony of Jews originally from Judea settled on the coast of Africa are black. This is talking about in Luango, right? M. Rosette declares that there are many Negresses in the Algerine country, whether they have doubtless been brought from the interior of Sudan and very probably from the Hausa, who are of a jet black color. This is saying certain Jews have a jet black color, but with truly Roman countenances. In one case, a degradation resembling that the instance among the Irish people have been recorded to have taken place in the oasis of Fizan. The general appearance the general appearance of the men in that locality is plain, and their complexion is black. The women are the same color and ugly in extreme. Neither sex is remarkable for figure, height, strength, vigor, or activity. They have a very peculiar cast of countenance which distinguishes them from other blacks. Their cheekbones are higher and more prominent, their faces flatter, and their nose is less depressed and more pointed at the top of the nose than the other Negroes. Their eyes are generally small and their mouths of immense width, but their teeth are generally good. Their hair is woolly, though not completely frizzled. They are a dull, phlegmatic people. Here we have with black skins, Negro faces, and woolly hair, a people descended from the white tribes of Arabia who still speak the language of that country. The Portuguese who planted themselves on the coast of Africa a few centuries ago have been succeeded by descendants blacker than many Africans. Now, first off, this is basically saying that the Jews are black and that you have a lot of people who migrated from Arabia into different places in the coast of Africa that are black. But it's also saying that they descend from white tribes of Arabia. See, that's an assumption, right? Because these people most likely are going based off of the color they see of the current occupants of Arabia and a lot of these different places in the so-called Middle East. So they're assuming that they descend from these people, that the black people descend from these people. However, history, archaeology and a lot of different other things can show us that the original Arabians were black, the original Judeans were black, the original Israelites were black. But this here is admitting that there are Jews who are black, who are in Africa, who are in West Africa, who are, in these places, the Congo, all these places where the slave trade took place, where slaves were taken from. So it says the Portuguese who planted themselves on the coast of Africa a few centuries ago have been succeeded by descendants blacker than many Africans. All right, let's go to the next source. This source is The Jews of Spain and Portugal, written by Frederick David in 1877. This is page 62 through 63. I'm just going to read the highlighted portion. It says, but this was not all. In the following April appeared another edict ordaining that all the children under 14 of those who had chosen exile rather than conversion should be forcibly taken from their parents and being distributed through the whole country should be handed over to persons who should bring them up in the Christian faith. This is talking about the children of the black, Spanish, and Portuguese Jews. Right, they're taken from their parents and they're handed over to people who's going to bring them up in the Christian faith. It says this barbarous edict was to be carried out at the approaching feast of Passover, which all Jews celebrate together in family groups. It says multitudes of children were hidden away by their parents, and many were concealed by the more merciful among the Christians. But all these were diligently sought out, dragged forth, and forced to the font. While many instances occur in which maddened fathers and mothers first destroyed their offspring with their own hands and then committed suicide. So basically what this is saying is during the Spanish Inquisition, while they were converting Jews and different things like that, edicts were passed, meaning laws were passed to where these Christians were allowed to take the children of these Jews and bring them up in Christian households, right? Because they didn't want them celebrating or keeping the law, statutes, and commandments of the Most High that these Jews were keeping. So what they would do is that they would take the children from the parents and raise them as Christians. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? When you hear about the slave trade and about colonization, what would they do? They would conquer these people and they would take their children from them and raise their children up as Christians. They happened to the Native Americans, it happened to the blacks, it happened to the Jews who are black, it happened to a lot of the African nations, who basically whoever were subject to the slavery of the colonizing powers, their children would be taken from them and raised how the colonizers wanted them to be raised. So it was nothing different with the Spanish Inquisition. This just kicked it off. The Spanish Inquisition predated the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade got most, if not all, of its tactics from the Spanish Inquisition. Even when you look at the Ku Klux Klan and the garb they wear with the hoods and everything, the white hoods, that is Spanish garb that comes from Spain. That comes from a lot of the Catholic Christians or the inquisitors, right? Basically, the people who burned these Jews alive and killed them and tortured them and all these different things and hung them on trees the same way they did us. Is the same thing. Let's go to the next source. This source is called History of the Jewish People by Max L. Margulis and Alexander Marx. I want to say this was written in the 1800s, either the 18 or the 1900s. But this is page 474. I'm going to read this highlighted excerpt. It says, after a long delay, ships were provided. Aboard these vessels, the unfortunate Jews endured untold suffering. Still worse was the fate of those who were left behind for want of space. They were sold as slaves, and their little ones were torn from their bosom and sent to the newly discovered island of Sao Tome or St. Thomas. So what we see right here during the Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion from Spain and Portugal, it says that among these ships, because the excuse me, the king agreed to get them, the ones who chose exile and who wanted to get out of the country. Basically, the king promised them ships that would take them from Spain and Portugal. But this is the thing. It says the ones who were left behind, who the ship got delayed, and they weren't able to get on the ship because there wasn't enough space. They were sold as slaves. Remember who started this transatlantic slave trade was the Portuguese, right? And the first slaves of the Portuguese were Jews, who just so happened that they banished these Jews and they took them to the newly discovered island of St. Thomas, which is right off of the coast of West Africa. It's right off of the coast of Nigeria and Benin and all these places. Sao Tome and Principe. This is where they took these people, right? Which is in West Africa. The majority of these children died during the voyage or were the prey of wild beasts upon their arrival. Only a few populated the island. Brothers even marrying their sisters in ignorance of their relationship. So this is kind of what happened to those children who were taken away from their parents. They were taken to the newly discovered island of Sao Tome. It says a lot of them died from the voyage or because of the beast and the different wild animals that populated the island. But it says a few populated the island, and brothers would even marry sisters. All right, next source. This is called The History of the Jews of Spain and Portugal by E.H. Lindo. I know this one was written in the 1800s as well. I'm going to read this little excerpt that's highlighted. It says, and we noticed Jew cavaliers mounted on richly comparison horses and mules in fine cloaks, cascocks, silk doublets, closed hoods, and with gilt swords that it is impossible to recognize them. Further, they enter churches, mock the holy sacraments, and mix with Christians to the great injury of the Catholic faith. So this is important because of the next slide I'm going to bring you to, which is a picture called the King's Fountain, right? In this picture, I want to say it was painted in the 15 or the 1600s. I'll tell you in just one second when we go to the slide. But note it says the first sentence, and we notice Jew cavaliers, right, mounted on richly caparisoned horses and mules in fine cloaks. All right, so let's go to this picture. What do you see right here, family? Jew cavaliers. Excuse me. A Jew cavalier. What color is this man? This man is jet black. Jew cavaliers on richly However you say that word. Hold on, let me go back to the last slide. Comparison horses and mules and fine clothes, cast socks, silk doublets, clothes hood with gilt swords. Got the swords, you got the cloaks, you got some with hoods on, or a hat rather. But you see the cloaks and different things they have on, right? So this is the king's fountain right here. View of a square with the king's fountain in Lisbon, Portugal. Dutch painting, ca 1570 to 1580. So this was in the 1500s. The king wears the cross of the Order of Santiago, which was founded in the 12th century and owes its name to the national patron of Galicia in Spain. All right, that's all I'm gonna read right there. So basically, it's kind of suggesting that this guy is the king, because it says the king wears the cross of the Order of Santiago. But in this excerpt we just read from this source by E.H. Lindo, it says the Jews were cavaliers. There were Jew cavaliers mounted on horses, right? And then you also see this guy right here, which I'm assuming is black too, based off of his hair. This looks like an afro right here, but also you see a little black boy right on the side of this horse. Then you see this guy right here who's black. Look at his hand. He's black. You see some white dudes right here. You see black children, black children, black children, a black man dancing with a white woman, black, black. So half of these people are black. You see black, you see all these black people, and you see white people. So it looks like it's half black and half white. Black, white. You see what I'm saying? Black, black. What are the black people? They have things on their head. They carry it on their head. Well, you also see a white person carrying things on their head too. But that source that we just read said the Jew cavaliers were mounted on richly caparisoned horses and mules and fine cloaks, cassocks, silk doublets, closed hoods with gilt swords. That is impossible to recognize them. You got to think a lot of these Jews were converted, because what did it say in this source? It says they mix with the Christians. They enter the churches, mock the holy sacraments, and mix with Christians, to the great injury of the Catholic faith. Because you got to think they were forcefully converting them, making them new Christians. So they were mixing with these Christians, right? That's why you see the crosses and different things like that. But this is a Jew on this horse. And look at what color this man is. This man is black. You see all these black people. So when they tell you the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, when they call them black, it just means that they were really tan white people. Why would they call them black, but you have black people in the country? Why not? Why wouldn't they just call them white people? You got plenty of white people here. And all these white people look to be the same complexion. The only difference in complexions is the dark black people or brown people, whatever you want to call us, and the white people, right? So when it's talking about swarthy or tawny, this is the color it's talking about. It's not talking about this color, because I don't see any other white person that is tan white. All you see is either black or white. But I digress. Let's go to the next point, next picture, right? This is also a part of that painting. This is a larger view of that painting. We see this guy right here, this Jew cavalier. We also see this guy with something on his head, and it looks like he's either bleeding. That's either blood or that's either fire, right? So you see some sort of persecution going on. And this is, mind you, this is the same time as what? The Spanish Inquisition, the auto de fe, or the acts of faith, which the Christians, the zealous Christians, would partake in, which means they would persecute the Jews to try to forcefully convert them. Okay, so you see this guy's potentially most likely a new Christian who is a Jew, but he's a new Christian. He's converted. He has some sort of power. You see this guy, he's being persecuted for whatever the reason may be, but that's either blood coming down or that's either fire. But nevertheless, he's being persecuted. You also see this person, which looks to be a younger woman with her head covered, being dragged away. She is being dragged away by two white people, by two Portuguese. Now, I ran across an article that was written by a I don't like to call them, you know, what the world calls them, but a current inhabitant of the land of Israel, right? An Israeli, if you will. This person was writing an article, and what they were saying in their article, basically trying to explain things away, they basically were saying, well, these black people, they were the slaves and different things like that, and they were being carried off, and the Jews are actually carrying this black person off. So this author was trying to say that these two people were Jews. These were the Jews. These were the Sephardic Jews. But if we go according to every historical document that we have read so far that was written in the 1800s, 1700s, early 1900s, it all says the Jews were black, tawny. It all says that they were called Negroes. It says the Jew, the Portuguese, and the Negro can be seen in the same person. And it also talks about what the persecution was, where they were being taken from their parents, right? Stripped away from their parents and taken to different places in West Africa. It also says that they were being burned alive, they were being killed, they were being persecuted. So how is it that these guys are doing the persecuting, but they're saying these are Jews? I thought the Jews were supposed to be the ones being persecuted. And the Jews were supposed to be the ones who were black and tiny and called Negroes. You see what I'm saying? So you have a lot of revisionist history. You have a lot of pseudo history that when you clearly read the sources and you put the pieces together, you see what is true. Because it's just not logical that these two white dudes would be Jews. Because how can you tell them apart from any other Portuguese, any other white Portuguese, when it says clearly in a lot of these sources, in all of these sources, that the Jews were black. The Spanish and Portuguese Jews were dark. They were Negroid. They were black. Some of them had an African look. A lot of them had an African look. The only people, according to what logic will tell me, what logic will say in general, from the sources we have read, the only people who could possibly be Jews in these portraits are the black people, are these people, because they're lining up with everything that it says happened to the Jews around this time. Jew Cavaliers, auto da fe, child taken from their parents. All right. Next picture. All right, this is just a zoom in. This is the guy with whatever it is on his head. And this looks like a young girl being taken away from her parents or being taken away for whatever reason. Next source. This deals with the auto da fe. Auto da fe are acts of faith by the Christians, by the zealous Christians, the Catholic Christians, where they thought that their zeal in the act of faith, meaning killing a Jew because they don't want to be a Christian, was somehow doing God's work. This is what they thought in their mind. So this source is the Inquisition Revealed, memoirs of its victims. This was written by Alot and Jones in 1851. Oh, I'm sorry, no, it was written by Reverend Thomas Timpson. I'm sorry, in 1851. I'm gonna read this highlighted version. It says, Delon waited in hope of the next auto da fe, or act of faith. And after a length of time, he was roused one night by the gaolers bearing lights, having dressed himself and put on a black garment stripped with white lines and a pair of drawers, which they had brought for him. He was led into the galleries where he joined about 200 other prisoners. This is the Spanish Inquisition. These are the prisoners who were taken as prisoners. The same people who were sold as slaves, the same people who were persecuted, the Jews, the black Jews, all ranged against the wall. They were mostly colored. So these 200 prisoners, most of them were colored. Now, if these were just Africans who were just, in Portugal at this time because they had been brought as slaves, if they had been brought as slaves, why are they not being persecuted in acts of faith and being prisoners if they're supposed to be just slaves? They're not Jews, they're just slaves. They just, the Portuguese, they brought slaves up to Portugal. Okay, so why are they being in the same acts of faith, in the same persecutions as the Jews and those who don't want to convert to the Roman religion? It's because these same blacks are the Jews. All right, it says they were mostly colored. And isn't it funny, right? As African Americans, Black Americans, whatever you want to call us, they've never, from our inception in this country, they've never called us Africans. They never called us, West Africans or by the so-called tribes and different things like that. Although some of us do descend from those West African tribes, but for the most part, they never called us Africans. What have they always called us? They called us Negro, colored. And that's the same. Negro is a Spanish word. Why are they calling us a Spanish word? Because who started the transatlantic slave trade? Spain and Portugal. And what did they call those slaves? Negroes, colored. And who are those slaves that they sold first? Jews. And then they started selling the slaves from the coast where the Portuguese had taken the Jews, where the Portuguese had colonized Angola, Negro land, Luango, all these different places. Sao Tome. This is where they took slaves from. So the same place where they dumped the Jews, who they, took away and expelled from their countries, the same place where they ran them to, they also took slaves from. And the same things they called them, they call us. Come on, y'all, let's make it make sense. It's all connecting. All right, I digress. Let's get back into it. They were mostly colored men. There were only about 12 white persons among them. So out of 200, only 12 was white. The rest was colored or Negro or Black. There were female prisoners in another gallery and several men in a cell with their confessors exhorting them to return to the true faith as they were to be burnt as heretics. Why are they burning colored people if the colored people are just their slaves? Why are they doing that? No, it's because these colored people are the Jews and they're calling them heretics and telling them to return to the true faith. All right, next slide. This is commentaries on Hebrew and Christian mythology. This is written by Judge Parrish B. Ladd. I want to say this one's from the 1900s. But basically, this is the banishment from France. It talks about the banishment from France and the auto da fe in France. So it says, it is well-established history that in France alone, thousands of Jews were burned at the stake. On one occasion, 160 men, women, and children were bound hand and foot and thrown into a ditch. Wood was piled on them, the torch applied, while numbers of priests stood by with uplifted hands, calling on their Savior to witness the suffering of the unbelieving Jews. So this is an auto da fe from France where it says 160 men, women, and children were burned. This is what would happen in those auto da fe or those acts of faith. All right, let's go on to another source. This is 12 Centuries of Jewish Persecution, written by Gustav Perelson. I'm going to read the highlighted portion. And it says, Lorente, a secretary to the Court of Blood, says of this massacre, critical history of the Inquisition. So this was a massacre. And this was most likely the Vitimus du Massacre Judaico of 1506. And that's going to be important later. But Lorente, a secretary of the Court of Blood, says of this massacre, critical history of the Inquisition, they slew and mangled their victims, casting many while still alive into the fires. The Negroes and vilest rabble had kindled at the church doors, to which they kept constantly adding fuel. Now, hold on. I want to pause, because this is a massacre that happened in Portugal, right? 1506. We see in the 1506. Portugal in 1506. The same massacre that is called Vitimus do Massacre Judaico, meaning the massacre, the victims of the massacre were the Jews, right? So this was a massacre of the Jews. Why is it saying that they slew and mangled their victims, casting many while still alive into the fires? The Negroes and the vilest rabble had kindled at the church doors, to which they kept constantly adding fuel. So the Negroes and the vilest rabble, meaning the vilest people and the Negroes, were cast into the fire. They were slew and mangled and cast into the fire. that had kindled at the door of the church, which they kept constantly adding fuel. On the Monday, the numbers of the mob were considerably increased from the surrounding villages. The massacre and butchery of the new Christians was continued. The houses were broken open, whole families being murdered, meaning the Jews, the new Christians. The merciless wretches dashed out the brains of infants against the walls. So these people were dashing out the brains of infants against walls. This was in Portugal. Pregnant women were thrown from the windows on the pikes of those below. Women were were uh, women were outraged and virgins violated. Such were the horrors committed in the capital of Portugal on that day. On that day of the massacre of the Jews of the Judaico, it calls them Negroes. It says their babies' heads was dashed against the walls. The virgins were raped. They were burned alive, slew and mangled. All these different things. The mob had done all of this. Does this sound familiar as far as what happened to us in America? You ever seen Rosewood? What happened in Rosewood? The white woman made a false accusation, said a black man had beat her, raped her, all this type of stuff. What ensued next? A mob. What always ensues? What ensues? What ensued in the Tulsa massacre? A mob. This has always been the way of the Visigoth, of the white man, the European man, as far as those who have persecuted us. Now, again, this is not talking about every white person, every white European man or woman, but from our perspective, who has oppressed us and massacred our people, it has come at the hands of the white man. But do you all see that connection of what was happening way back in 1506 with our ancestors, the Negroes and the violence rabble, the black Jews, the ones who are swarthy, all these different things? What happened? Mob violence, mob killing, mob massacres. Same thing happened in Rosewood. Same thing happened in Tulsa. Same thing happened in Oscarville. Same thing happened in what's that town that used to be under Lake Lanier? Same thing happened up there, Forsyth County, Georgia. All of these different places, same thing happened. It's always a mob, and then a massacre ensues. All right, next source. All right, so we're gonna go into what a Macumbo is, right? Because this is what these neighborhoods were called where blacks live. And in the Macumbo, it means a refuge for fleeing slaves. And it says, and this is important because we just read about the Vitimus do Massacre Judaico in 1506, right? So beneath the pavement of today's Rua do Pocos dos Negros, or the street of the blacks pits, lies a mass burial pit of enslaved Africans in what used to be called Macumbo. In fact, as Sweet has found, Macumbo is widely known as a spiritually powerful space, perhaps an embedded and communal memory of the dead Africans who were buried there. Right? So the Macumbo, right, which is what it was called, the neighborhood, the black neighborhood where the blacks live. In the Macumbo, beneath the pavement of today's Rua do Pocos dos Negros, or the street of the blacks pit, lies a mass burial pit of enslaved Africans, right? Because this is where a lot of Africans or blacks were killed at. But we just also read about the massacre of the Judaico, the massacre of the Jews. So this Macumbo, right, or the Pocos dos Negros, right? The street of the blacks pit, right, where the blacks were buried. In 1515, King Manuel ordered that a massive burial site known as Pocos dos Negros be built and filled with quicklime and lives in Portugal. All right, so the Vitimus do Massacre Judaico happened in 1506. The Macumbo is the neighborhood where the blacks live, right? And beneath the pavement, the Pocos dos Negros, or the street of the blacks pit, is a massive burial site of enslaved, quote unquote, enslaved Africans. In 1515, the Pocos dos Negros was built. Pocos dos Negros is also on the corner of Jew Street. Pocos dos Negros, Travessa do Judeo. These are the victims that was buried in Pocos dos Negros. The Macombo, Jew Street is also in Macombo, or the black neighborhood. Who's buried in the black neighborhood? Pocos dos Negros, the Black's Pit. The Black's Pit is on the corner of Jew Street. The Jews lived here too. 1506, 9 years before the pit was built, you had the mass massacre of the Jews, who were called the Negroes. Right here. They were still alive. They were slewed and mangled. Their victims, casting many while still alive into the fires. The Negroes in the vilest rabble. Ladies and gentlemen, the Black's Pit is where the Spanish and Portuguese Jews who were killed in the Vitimus do Massacre Judaico were buried. It don't get more it don't get more clear than that. It doesn't get any more clear than that. Now, I'm gonna sum it up again, because I know that was a lot to take in. We read about the Vitimus do Massacre Judaico in 1506, which happened in Portugal, Lisbon. It talks about what happened. It talks about what happened. Now, it says, excuse me, y'all, I got a little gas. It says they slew and mangled their victims, casting many while still alive into the fires. The Negroes and the vilest rabble. The vilest rabble are those who are considered heretics. But mainly the Negroes. Because remember when we read the source where it talks about the auto de fe, they were mostly colored men. We see what colored men would be. The King's Fountain. Let's look at the King's Fountain again. The Jew Cavalier. Colored men. Colored people. The only people that's colored in this picture are jet black ones. Everybody else is white. We see the colored people who are black. So this is what happened. They was burned alive. The women was raped. Virgins was raped. The babies they had was dashed against the walls. Pregnant women were thrown on pikes. Their houses was broken into. They was butchered and massacred. A lot of people in this Macombo, this black neighborhood. This is where it happened, on the corner of Jew Street, Travessa do Judeo, meaning Jew Street, the Pocos dos Negros, which is a mass grave site, was built in 1515, 9 years after the Vitimus do Massacre Judaico, in the same place where it happened. But they're trying to write it off and say these were just African slaves that was killed. What were they killed for? Let's go into the archaeological remains. In the early 15th century, Portuguese explorers like Henry the Navigator began sailing to Africa, bringing back both goods and enslaved people. A new archaeological study of more than 150 skeletons dumped in Lagos, Portugal, revealed that many of the enslaved Africans were not given proper burials, and that several of them may have even been tied up at death. Tied up at death. They slew and mangled their victims, casting many while still alive. The fires that the Negro and the violence rabble kindled at the church doors, which they kept constantly adding fuel. Right? This is what they were doing. Reveals that many enslaved Africans were not given proper burials, and that several of them may have even been tied up at death. The skeletons come from the site of Valley da Gafaria, which is located outside the medieval walls of the port city of Lagos along the southwest coast of Portugal, used between the 15th and 17th century as a dumping ground. The site also offered up remains of important ceramics, butchered animal bones, and a few African-style ornaments. When the human skeletons were first analyzed, their shape and unique dental style suggesting that they may have been of African origin. And later genetic analysis confirmed ancestry with Southern African Bantu-speaking populations. Due to the archaeological and historical information, it is likely that these people were enslaved. See, they're just trying to draw a conclusion or come up with their own history. We just read in history who these people were. We read who these people were. Of course, they were genetically related to the Bantu. The Bantu were Israelites. But this is an assumption. A new research article published in the International Journal of Osteoarchaeology, Maria Teresa Ferreira, Catarina Coelho, and Sophia Westerland of the University of Coimbra dug further into the bone data in order to understand how 158 enslaved Africans came to be buried in a trash pit in Lagos. Specifically, they investigated the position of each burial, whether or not the burial were made with care, and whether they could identify any evidence that the person's body had been found. So they still trying to dig into this because they know who these people were. These were Jews. These were the Jews who were killed in the Vitimus du Massacre Judaico. And this pit, Pocos dos Negros, just so happens to be on the corner of Travessa do Judeo or Jew Street. It just so happens to be there. All right, let's look at some of the persecution. This is a narrative of persecution. Basically, the Spanish Inquisition, written in 1811. Should any person be punished by the Holy Office for the crime of bigamy, if the same person fall again into the same crime after having on the first lapse abjured de levi, in the second he shall abjure vehemently and shall be condemned, not being a nobleman, to public whipping and sent to the galleys for the period of from 8 to 10 years. And being a woman, she shall be exiled for that time to Angola or Sao Tome. And on a repetition of this crime, there shall be inflicted more rigorous spiritual penances. This is what Christians were doing, y'all. If in the first instance they have abjured vehemently, they shall not abjure in the second, but shall incur the penalties of whipping and exile. Mind you, these were Jews who were mostly persecuted in the Spanish Inquisition. And what was their punishment? Either to go to the galleys or the prisons for 8 to 10 years, or the women shall be exiled to Angola or Sao Tome, West Africa. Why are they expelling Jews to West Africa? All right. This is The Jews of Spain and Portugal in the Inquisition by Frederick David Mercado. This is from 1877. These are all verifiable sources. Please go read them. Check them out. Please verify them. I'm not just putting these out of nowhere. Page 57. Unfortunately, at the time of the expulsion, the plague was raging in Castile, and the fugitives brought with them the disease, propagating it, whether they went and not unnaturally causing their advent to be viewed with loathing and horror. The circumstance induced King John to hasten their departure from Portugal, for which purpose ships were duly provided according to the agreement. The agreement of what? For the Jews. But such was the temper of the captains and sailors that they subjugated the Jews to the hardest possible conditions. They plundered them of their goods and valuables, even to their very clothes, and landed them naked and bare of everything on barren points of the African coast. So on these ships, the captains and the sailors, they subjugated the Jews to the hardest possible conditions. It sounds familiar. What they were doing on slave ships. We were subjected to the hardest possible conditions. This is also happened to the Jews, who were called black, who were called Negro, who were called colored. They plundered them of their goods, took their clothes from them, and guess where they left them at? Points of the African coast, leaving them to die of starvation or to be sold into slavery to the Moors. Who was helping round up slaves in West Africa? Was it not the Mohammedans? Or who you would call the Moors? Okay. Nor was this all. The king wrested from their parents all children between the ages of 3 and 10 of those Jewish immigrants from who from poverty or otherwise had omitted to pay the capitation tax on entering, or who were forced to remain in Portugal and had them transported to the newly discovered islands of St. Thomas, which then swarmed with alligators and other beasts of prey, to be brought up as Christians. So the children were taken to Sao Tome to be brought up as Christians. And also slaves, because what did they have on Sao Tome? Sugar plantations. Who were those who worked the sugar plantations? The Jews or the Negroes. Okay. Next source, the Dutch Reformation, a history of the struggle in the Netherlands for civil and religious liberty in 16th century by Carlos Martin. This is just talking about the Inquisition, but I want to point out something. The code of the Inquisition, with all the punishments for every supposed crime, together with the mode of conducting the trial so as to elicit the guilt of the accused. All this is contained in a large manuscript volume in folio, carefully preserved by the head of the Holy Office and styled Praxis Secure Romance Inquisitions, and sometimes Libro Negro, the Black Book, because it has a cover of that color. Or as an inquisitor once said, the Libro Negro, the Book of the Dead. Who was the dead? Who was being killed? The Negro was being killed. But it's just ironic they called this book Libro Negro, but they also called the Jews of Spain and Portugal Negro, and colored, and black. And the Jew, the Negro, and the Portuguese could be seen in a single person. And the Jew, who was the Negro, was persecuted in the Spanish Inquisition, and the punishment of those who are persecuted, or the Jews, the punishment of the Jews was written in the Libro Negro, or the Book of the Negro, or the Book of the Dead. Come on, man, this is coming full circle. This is coming full circle. We almost done, y'all. Got a few more slides. I'm gonna end it there today, and then we're gonna get in DNA. So this is the Portuguese exploration to the west and the formation of Brazil from 1450 to 1800. All right. I'm going to read the highlighted portion. By the year 1470, the Portuguese had found the equatorial island of Sao Tome in the Guinean Gulf off the African coast. The climate proved to be extremely unwholesome for Europeans, and settlement was slow. All right. This is why the Jews had to be black. They couldn't have been white Europeans, because why would they, first off, take the children to Sao Tome to work it and become new Christians and everything? But also, they would take the Jews, subject them to the worst punishments on the ships, and they would even take their clothes and leave them on the African coast to either be sold as slaves or whatever, or to die. Okay, but the climate of West Africa, of the Guinean Gulf, Sao Tome, West Africa, all these different places, was unwholesome for Europeans, and settlement was slow because Europeans couldn't settle it. Why is that? Because of the unwholesome air, because of malaria. Because Europeans, without that malaria vaccine that is, has just been created in modern times, without that, Europeans wouldn't be able to go to certain places. All right, the official chronicler of King Giles II, 1481 through 1495, Garcia de Rezende, reports on one of the methods to populate this island that also throws some light on a tragic form of Jewish participation in the Portuguese Atlantic Empire. The king had allowed Jewish refugees from Spain, from where they had been expelled in 1492, to remain in Portugal only in return for payment of an enormous ransom. In 1493, those who could not pay had their children taken away from them, baptized by force, and departed to Sao Tome in order to be raised as Christians. Why would they be deported to an island that's unwholesome for Europeans if they're European? Just a question. All right. To be raised as Christians and to help populate the island that the king had just leased to Alvaro de Camina at an annual rate of 100,000 reeds. Nothing is known of the further fate, although later chroniclers attribute the thriving sugar production on the island to the talents of those deported children and their offspring. Those deported Jewish children, Hebrew children, and their offspring. Thriving sugar production in a place that's unwholesome for Europeans. That was called the white man's graveyard, because they would die from malaria. The Jewish children thrive there, but they're European. Come on, man. They were Negro. They were black people. All right. Let's just look at a map real quick. We see Negro land right here. Sao Tome is around here. This is where Sao Tome is. Spain, Portugal is all up here. This is where they traveled, right? You got the Sahara, you got Negro land, you got, Senegal and all these different places. And this is the Luango coast right here. This is an enlarged view. This is Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, Principe, Sao Tome. This is Sao Tome. This is where the Jewish children were exiled to, where they had thriving sugar plantations. This is also where a lot of Jews, Spanish and Portuguese Jews were exiled to, was the Luango coast, because who controlled the Luango coast from Angola to Congo to Gabon? It was the Portuguese, right? Those Portuguese settlements was all up and through here, around this area as well. Now let's look at, basically a breakdown of the transatlantic slave trade. Point number 5, this is British North America. This is where my diaspora would come from. All right. Where did most of the slaves come from? The Luango coast, 41%. 41%. Only 500,000 slaves came to North America. Brazil got most of them. 5% from East Africa, 41% from Congo and Angola, the Luango coast, where you also see the Mavumbu Jews, where you also see descendants of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. 14% comes from, where's this? Negro land, Benin. 20% Negro land, also Nigeria area. And then, you got the 10, 5, 4, 2, all of that. So most of the slaves came from where the Jews were exiled to, the Luango coast. The first, quote unquote, Africans, the first slaves brought, was 29 Negroes. I'm going to read this. It says, the first Africans arrived in Virginia because of the transatlantic slave trade across 3.5 centuries, from 1501 to 1867. More than 12.5 million Africans were captured, sold, and transported to the Americas, while Portugal and Spain were the first European powers engaged in this trade. Eventually, most of the European powers would get involved. It was as profitable as it was brutal. The Africans who came to Virginia in 1619 had been taken from Angola in West Central Africa. They were captured in a series of wars that was a part of much broader Portuguese hostilities against the Congo and Ndongo kingdoms and other states. These captors were then forced to march 100 to 200 miles to the major slave trade port of Luanda. They were put on board the San Juan Batista, which carried 350 captives bound for Veracruz on the coast of Mexico in the summer of 1619. So these slaves who came to America was originally supposed to go to Mexico. Nearing her destination, the slave ship was attacked by 2 English privateers, the White Lion and the Treasurer, in the Gulf of Mexico, and robbed of 50 to 60 Africans. These 2 privateers then sailed to Virginia, where the White Lion arrived at Point Comfort, or present-day Hampton, Virginia, and I've been there before, toward the end of August. John Rolfe, a prominent planter and merchant, and formerly the husband of Pocahontas, reported that 29 Negroes were bought for victuals. The majority of the Angolans were acquired by wealthy and well-connected English planters, including Governor Sir George Yardley and the Cape, or head merchant Abraham Pearsley. The Africans were sold into bondage despite Virginia having no clear-cut laws sanctioning slavery. And this was the beginning of slavery in the 13 colonies and later for the whole United States of America. Jamestown, Virginia. Never forget. But they came from Angola, the same place where a lot of the Jewish children of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews who went to Sao Tome later immigrated to Angola, the coast of Luanda, where you had the Mavumbu Jews, where you had a Portuguese settlement, where a lot of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews were exiled to, where you also have Israelites who were there before from the 10 tribes, the Bantus, right? Bantu expansion, that they back migrated into Africa, or they migrated into Africa. Okay. Last slide. First African Baptist Church, Savannah, Georgia, which is right up the street from me. You have the pews, the famous pews everybody be talking about. That a lot of the, you know, Christians or whoever, you know, white supremacists, as I like to call them, they try to discredit. They say this is Arabic, can't be Hebrew, none of that. But Arabic linguists have, you know, said this can't be Arabic script. This ain't gibberish, it's something, right? And you got to think there weren't a lot of Arabic slaves or slaves who were Mohammedans or Muslim. You know, Omar Said was a rarity. And when they found out that he was, you know, a Muslim and who was somebody, he was captured, he was a prince, he was returned back, right? He went back to Africa. They returned him, they petitioned, they got him back, right? Because Muslims can't sell other Muslims into slavery. So that was a rarity. So this can't be Arabic. The linguist said this isn't Arabic, but it is a language. This is what you call Spanish Hebrew, Spanish cursive Hebrew. It's a Sephardic Hebrew. This is Sephardic Hebrew that's written on these pews. That's what this is. As you can kind of see the letters, the Aleph and the Tav and, you know, the Gimel, Dalet, all these. This is cursive Hebrew. That's what's written on these pews in Savannah, Georgia. Right? All right. That concludes the history portion. We're going to get into the DNA next. We got quite a bit of slides. Quite a bit. But the DNA shouldn't take too long. But probably one or two more videos. But, you know, as we went through the history, there's just certain things that are undeniable. Let me just get back to the start it right there. Close that down. All right. So as we went through the history, the 10 tribes, Spanish, Portuguese, Jews, we went over a lot of the different depictions of ancient Israelites. We went into scripture, prophecy, and all these different things. We can clearly see it's undeniable. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my dispersed, right? What's beyond the rivers of Ethiopia? That's West Africa, Central Africa, right? And so we went into the Spanish and Portuguese Jews where they claim they were black. We see depictions of them being black. They're called Negro, they're called color, all of these different things. We've seen that the same pit, Pocos dos Negros, the black's pit, is on the corner of Travessa do Judeo or Jew Street. It was built 9 years after the Vito do Massacre Judaico, or the massacre of the Jews. Same area, same time frame, and this is where they were buried at, bound up. They found these skeletons, and they said most of these people had been bound, tied up. What does this remind you of? Auto da Fe's, Act of Faith. But you think that was something? Wait till we get into the DNA. The DNA gonna tie it all together. It's gonna be undeniable. So if you're watching this video and you think that, well, you know, this is all delusion, please, I'm begging you, prove me wrong with sources, not with assumptions and with feelings, but please provide tangible sources that are logically sound. And I'm more than willing to listen. But with that, I'm gonna let y'all go. I'm gonna say Shabbat Shalom. I appreciate y'all for tuning in. Pray this bless y'all. And with that, I'm gonna let y'all go. Peace and blessings, family.